Hello, this is Nicholas Pellegrino from asileFX, and I'd like to welcome you to Getting Started with Vue 5 Infinite. And in this tutorial, I'll be showing you most of the basics of Vue 5, and then going in depth in some of the better features of Vue and some of the more advanced features. And by the end of this tutorial, you'll be able to create some really neat stuff in Vue. So we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, if you notice here, we have 4 separate viewports: our top view, side view, front view, and main camera view. And if you haven't worked with 3D before, this is called Orthographic Projection. And if you have worked with 3D before, this is probably pretty familiar to you. Now to navigate through our different viewports, there are different settings. Our major viewports are top, side, and front view. We can navigate by right mouse clicking and moving them around. And as you can see, we're also moving our other viewports along with it. What we can also do is go up here and we have our zoom out, a little magnifying glass for zoom out and zoom in. And what we could also do is control and right mouse click, and then we could also zoom that way as well. And that'll give you a more fluid zoom. But sometimes, depending on how much geometry you have in the scene, sometimes it's actually better to use these little magnifying glasses. Now the main camera view is set up a little differently. If you look over to the right over here, underneath our preview window, we have a little trackball where you can rotate the camera around and look anywhere in the scene. And underneath that, or well, to the left and down below, we have our move camera in and out. Just click on that and move the mouse around, and you can go in and out. And above that is our camera zoom, so we can zoom in and out, which gives you an entirely different effect. And to the left of that is our main camera movement. And what we can do is, if we have all 4 of these arrows showing, we can move it up and down, left and right, just about anywhere. But if we go down here, right here, or up on the top, you see we have 2 arrows pointing up and down. That means we're constraining to the up and down axes. Or we can go left and right, and then we're constraining to those axes. Now what I like to do, I'm just going to do this right off the bat, is go ahead and grab this window over here and kind of pull it out, and that will give us a larger preview of the scene that we're working with. And it might take a little bit longer to render, but it is a preview window, and if you change your settings to maybe a little bit lower, if we right mouse click on it, we can take a look at the preview quality. We can set it to fast, and that will render a lot quicker now, just in 1 or 2 passes, but it'll give you a much better representation of what it is you're doing in the scene. I also want to note that underneath this we have our layers panel, which is showing every single object in the scene. And what you can actually do is create layers for separate objects. Like if you have terrains, or several different terrains, you can put those in their own layer. And you can also turn off these layers. Of course, we only have 1 right now, so we can't really turn that off. But if I was to go down here and click New Layer, and then we could also grab the ground and drag it into that layer. And now if we turn off the layer and then deselect it, you'll see that our ground plane is now gone. It's still showing up in the preview window because it's still in the scene. It's just not showing up in our preview or our OpenGL view. So I'm going to turn that back on, and now you can see our grid is back. But you can sort through any of the objects and make their own layers for them, turn them off if you want to, turn them on, and sometimes it's best to do that because if you're working with specific objects, like let's say you have a large landscape and a lot of the ecosystem applied to it, but you're working on maybe a small house or something in the area, you might want to turn off everything except the house, and that way you could keep the house on its own layer, and it's a lot easier to work with and might work out a little bit quicker in the OpenGL view. What you can also do, if you want to make these full view, each one of these viewports, you can go ahead and double click on the bar up on top, and that will make that view, full screen. And you double click on it again and it'll bring it back. And you can do this with any of the views. So that's a lot better if you're working with large scale objects, and you can really zoom in and pinpoint certain things, and it just lets you see what's going on a little bit better. If we go up to the top here too, you'll notice there's our options for our objects. Of course, we don't have anything selected right now, so you won't see anything. But if I select the sunlight down here in the layers panel, you'll see that we have all of our light options. We could set our color, the softness of the light, whether or not it points at the camera, our display color for it, and whether or not you want to exclude it from radiosity. And if you're not sure what radiosity is, we're going to be covering that in a little bit. But we also have our other settings over here. If I go ahead and rotate our camera up to the sun so we can see it in the view, we can see it's actually quite bright. Mostly that's because of the cloud layer. So I'm going to go ahead and just pull this down about to the horizon so we can really get a good look at the sun. As you can see, we have this huge lens flare and lens reflections with it. And this first button up here is our lens flare editor and our lens flare options. And below that we have gels, so we could apply a picture, sort of a projection image onto that. You could also use that with volumetric lighting, which you can check on right here, which definitely works best with spotlights and point lights. And we have whether or not it casts shadows and different lighting options for that. We'll get into that a little more later. But if we click on this next tab up here, this is our orientation view, showing our position, our orientation, our size, twist, and then our pivot position. And this is the same for every single object. This first view will change depending on what kind of object you have. Sunlight is a little bit different than if we were to, I'm going to go over here to the left and just click the sphere button. And I'm going to use the top view to move that in front of the view. But if we select that sphere, and now you notice in this first view, what we get is our material options. And this is showing our material that's on the surface right now. And we can change the scale of that. Little options down here, whether or not to exclude it from certain things, from the G buffer or from ecosystems. And what we could also do is click this little arrow right here, and that'll bring up our chooser to load a material. But I'm just going to delete this sphere right now, and we're going to go back and select our sunlight and show you some of the other options. This last tab is our motion tab. And you can set up certain types of animations, sort of preset animations, like airplane and certain things like that, which will basically automatically set up certain animations depending on what it is you're animating. Sometimes it could be a good thing, sometimes you might need a little bit more, and you won't need to use this. But we're going to go over that in a little bit. But this is all for animation. You can also link your objects to other objects in here. We could link this to the main camera. And if we actually go down here to this last tab down here, this is our links. And it's showing our linked objects, not necessarily the sun with the main camera, but we'll be showing you that in a little bit. If we click on this middle tab down here, this is our material section, and it's showing every single material that's in the scene. As you can see, we have clouds, cumulus, and this is our sky, the materials for our sky. And right here is default, which is our texture or material that's on our ground plane. So there's really only 3 materials in the scene right now, 2 for the sky and 1 for, which is the default for any object you load until you start choosing what materials you want, and then it will automatically grab that last material you applied to something else when you create a new object. Now if we look over here at our preview window, we can kind of see what the sky looks like, and this is our default sky. Every time you load Vue, it will give you the sky in the scene unless you're opening a saved scene file. Now, let's say we don't like this sky. Well, first what I'm going to do is double click on the main camera view up here on the bar and make it full screen, because we can also get a preview of our sky gradient in this view. And it also works with volumetrics, which don't use sky gradients. But let's say we don't like this scene or the sky that we have right now. We can go up to atmosphere, load atmosphere, and this is going to give us our chooser for all the different preset atmospheres and skies in Vue. And it comes with quite a bit. If you notice here, they're all categorized with bad weather, basic sunshine, realistic sunset, simple sunset, and keep on going through all the different options. As you can see, we got some pretty nice skies in here, and you can just go through and select which ones you want. And keep in mind that you're not just loading a sky, you're loading an entire atmosphere, which means it includes fog and haze and certain lighting aspects. Your sun is also linked to these presets, which means the position of it, the lens flare options, and all that is saved within this preset. And you can also create your own. which we'll be showing you in just a little bit. But we're going to go ahead and just grab a realistic sunset. And if we take a look at Roman sunrise, we'll just use that one and click OK. You can see that it moved our camera up, or sorry, moved our sun up. So if we move it up a little higher, we can see our sun is up there, as opposed to when it was down here, and that will just move along with our preset. But as you can see, we have a lot nicer sky now, a little more realistic, and a nice little sunset or sunrise. We could also move the camera or move the light down just by clicking on it and dragging it down. And as you can see, our light just went away, and that's because it's going behind the ground plane. And you could have a sunrise. You could even animate this, which I'll be showing you in a little bit. But let's say you don't like these lens flare, these lens reflections right here. You can go up, since we already have our sunlight selected in our layers panel, we can go up here to our top button, which is our lens flare editor, and right mouse click and click edit lens flare. And this will bring up our lens flare options for that sun, or any light actually you can use these with. And if you take a look here, what I'm going to do is increase the intensity of this ring, and then you can see it's putting a ring around the lens flare. You can increase the radius of it, or you could just turn it off altogether. You could also adjust the color of that as well. We have random streaks, so we can increase the streaks, as you can see right here, and the sharpness of those streaks and how many streaks there are, or you can turn that off. And then reflections, as you can turn off reflections as well. Now with reflections, you can also adjust the intensity. You can also match it up to whatever type of film you're matching up a scene to, if you are doing that. Or you can also create custom ones. Now if you look here, after selecting customs, the lens flare reflection editor just has so many options. You can pretty much match up any lens flare that you could possibly get in a camera by each single circle's position. You could also change this to some of the other presets, and there's just tons of different options here to give you different colors and sizes and positions, and just each intensity can be different. There's just a lot you can do with it. So if you want to play around with that, you can do a lot of different stuff. But I'm gonna hit X on there and turn off reflections, because I don't want those in the scene, because I want it to look like we're actually physically looking at the scene and not filming it. If we come up here, we have our major settings, which is our flare intensity, which will adjust the overall flare of that sun. And we can also adjust the rotation. Now, unless you have other things on, if we turn on anamorphism, we can adjust the rotation, and it doesn't really do anything. But if we turn on random streaks and go ahead and adjust our rotation, you can see that our streaks are rotating around. And I'm going to take anamorphism down to 1 and go ahead and turn off those streaks again, and just click OK. You can also adjust your color shift. Right now we have it kind of red, but you could adjust that to pretty much any color. But the red actually looks good right now, because as you can see, it's showing up as a nice yellow in the scene. You can also put a star filter on that. As you can see, we have a different point star filter, and you could bring that up to about 10. And then substars too, you could turn that on or off. You can't really see it because the intensity is not very high. We also have fade off screen, which is going to fade off as the sun is moving out of the screen. The lens flare will fade out. Fade behind objects, same thing. If we have an object in the scene and the sun goes behind that object, it will fade, which is realistic. If you don't have this on, then you'll notice that if I just go ahead right now, I'm going to click OK and go up here and create a sphere. Zoom out so we can see that sphere. Rotate around and see if we can find it. I'm just going to use the 4-point view, which is probably the best way to find an object. Double click on it and see we can have our sphere now. And I'm going to zoom out. Alright, and we can see that our camera is over to the right. So what we can do is drag this over in front of the view of the camera. And then we can also bring it up. And as you can see now, we have our sphere blocking the sun. So if I move that right in front of it, now I go back to select our sun and go back to our lens flare options, edit lens flare. and we take a look at fade behind objects and we turn that off and click OK, you'll see that we still have our lens flare showing through that object now. Now if that's the effect you're looking for, then you can use that. Otherwise I'd suggest just keeping that on, because it's a little more realistic that way. I'm going to go ahead and delete the sphere now. And we get our updated preview. And now we're going to start kind of creating some objects for our scene, and I'm going to go through all the different objects that we can create.